On a particular sunny day when light hesitantly poked through the clouds, a young man wandered about. But the brightness of that afternoon should not fool anyone, for there was a piercing cold that traveled in the wind in Sherwood and a layer of fog that didn't want to leave. This young man walked briskly and merrily, whistling about on his way and swinging his arms along with his strides. Despite his hood covering his head, his curly brown hair could not be entirely hidden. His robe-like cloak, old, weathered and torn at some points, also dark brown in color like the soil he walked on, suited him well for these strolls in Sherwood. For this gentleman was Robert Timothy Fitzooth, also known by the people as Robin Hood. Robin was a yeoman, that is, the status representing middle-class folk. They sat in the social gap between peasantry, those who were often tied to the land as serfs, and the gentry or nobility, those who held titles and massive estates. Being a yeoman meant you owned or farmed your own land, typically 30 to 100 acres. You weren't a lord, but you weren't subject to a master's whim either. You would be deemed too rich to the poor and too poor for the rich. Unlike serfs, a yeoman could move around, sign contracts and bear arms. Such arms were necessary by law. Yeomen were legally required to own a longbow and practice with it daily, since they were also the backbone of English military. However, Robin Hood's farm had unlawfully been taken away from him 2 years ago. Because yeomen had something to lose but no noble titles to protect them, they were the primary targets of corrupt local officials. They became the folks who were bullied. Therefore, while not officially, Robert Fitzooth had become classified as a peasant with nothing to his name. He had no choice but to become a high-functioning outlaw, robbing from the rich and giving to the poor, trying to survive in a brutal, unfair world as he knew it. Though the name Robin Hood was coined for any hooded outlaw or thief found in the forest of Sherwood or masquerading under disguises in towns and villages, but his name had true meaning. He wasn't just an outlaw shaking up the hierarchy of social status. He was a man that people loved. His popularity grew not only because of his supernatural archery skills, but also with how he treated women, the poor, and honest laborers with immense respect, while remaining ruthlessly clever toward greedy officials. While he became an inexperienced thief, he operated under a strict code. He rarely killed unless necessary and reserved his violence for those who abused their power. With that being said, he was far from invincible, and on this particular chilly afternoon, that would be seen for itself. Robin Hood reached a rather short stone bridge across a shallow river, but to his surprise his pathway had become obstructed, for another yeoman had been crossing the bridge from the other end. A man that was at least 7 foot tall, with long, untidy and dirty blonde hair, wearing peasant clothing. The bridge had barely been spacious enough for him to cross through comfortably, let alone 2 people at the same time. He held a long wooden staff in his hand, one that felt average size in the hands of a giant. Robin Hood and the stranger met at the middle of the bridge. The archer looked up at the man like he was a tree that never stopped growing. He looked at the stranger's broad shoulders and arms like tree trunks. Without introducing himself, Robin said, "Forgive me, friend, but it seems we've reached an impasse. No matter, if you could just step aside and let me pass, our journey will not have any hindrance this afternoon. So, if you will." And Robin tried pushing himself through, expecting the stranger to at least turn to the side or budge with a command. But he didn't. This giant of a man just looked down at Robin and chuckled. The stranger in a low, deep voice said, "Funny you say that, friend, but I was about to tell you the same thing. So, if you would move to the side and I pass through first, we will have no problem on this wonderful afternoon." Robin Hood smiled, but deep down, burning in his soul, his frustration had been growing with every second. They both argued and commanded each other to step aside, but the pride of a yeoman sometimes worked against them in simple matters of quarrel. Thus Robin Hood drew an arrow in his bow and aimed it at the stranger. He was so tall that Robin felt like he aimed at the sky. The stranger mocked the outlaw for using a long-range weapon. He passed remarks on how his cowardice was sharper than the arrows he used. He called Robin's bluff, essentially saying that a true man would fight fair, face to face. Robin Hood, stung by the insult to his honor, put down his bow. He cut a thick oaken staff from the forest and agreed to a fair play duel on the bridge. The stakes were simple. The loser gets knocked into the water. They fought for a long time, with wood splintering and the air ringing with blows, until the stranger took a clean swipe at Robin Hood, sending him flat on his buttocks in the cold water. He laughed and got up to his feet, shivering, but admitting that he lost fairly. This matter of what seemed to be a fight for pride actually became the foundation for a brotherhood that day. The stranger was impressed at how a man much smaller than him, using a weapon that he had not mastered, had held his own for so long, while Robin Hood remarked upon the stranger's nimble movement for his size, as well as his strength and fight IQ. Robin Hood then introduced himself and explained his purpose in the land against the rich, evil, and the powerful. Respectfully, he offered the stranger to join him in the fight against such men, hoping for a better life for both peasants and yeomen. The stranger thought about it and agreed, introducing himself as John Little, an ironic name and a perfect display of antiphrasis, as John was anything but little. Thus, the giant warrior of a man will later be coined a new name of Little John as an inside joke among the group, a new addition to what would later be known as the Merry Men, a name thought of by the stranger in Scarlet. Robin Hood wandered through the forest when he spotted a stranger who looked completely out of place in the wilderness. While outlaws usually wore practical earth-toned wool, this man was dressed in vibrant scarlet silk and stockings. The stranger had long black hair tied into a ponytail and a long goatee that had been perfectly shaped and groomed. He was dashing, well-armed, and appeared remarkably calm for someone in the heart of outlaw territory. As was Robin's custom when meeting a formidable-looking stranger, he challenged him. Little John at the time was rather protective over Robin Hood, seeing him as a little brother, but according to the rules of a duel, he wasn't allowed to interfere. Robin first tried to intimidate the stranger with his long bow, but the stranger didn't flinch. Then he mocked Robin Hood for hiding behind a bow and challenged him to a fair fight with swords. Little John buried his face in his hand, shaking his head, knowing damn well Robin Hood dug himself into this trap and how easy it was for others to bait him into a fight that he was at a disadvantage to. Nevertheless, they fought for a long time, nearly an hour, and the stranger proved to be an expert dual-wielding swordsman, holding his own against the master outlaw. His appearance would provide the ultimate weapon of disguise, as a man who worried more about fashion than battle. Robin Hood, on the other hand, was no pushover when it came to a sword. For archery was what he mastered, but his sword was also a secret weapon that he wanted no one knowing he could wield. With the way he moved that dark, stormy night in the Sherwood Forest, Little John could not believe that archery was Robin Hood's greatest skill. He wondered if the outlaw would have bested him on the bridge if the weapon of choice was a sword. Robin was besting the man in the duel but called a halt to ask the stranger his name and his business. The stranger revealed he was young Gamwell, a man fleeing the law after killing his father's steward, the man responsible for his father's ruin and loss of estate. Upon hearing this, Robin realized the stranger was actually his own nephew, his sister's son. Young Gamwell has been doing exactly what Robin Hood had been, though at a much smaller scale and at a different angle. The Scarlet Stranger would steal fancy clothing only allowed to be donned by the rich and the higher class and give to the poor. Yes, it was an insult to the higher class, sending them a message, but it also provided the poor with warm clothing to help them get by during the winters. Robin immediately welcomed him to the group, and because of the man's striking red clothing, he was nicknamed Will Scarlet. And while Robin Hood bested the Scarlet Stranger in battle, when he met the next member of the Merry Men, he wouldn't be so lucky. A friar was a very specific kind of religious figure, distinct from a monk. While a monk lived a sheltered life kept away from the outside world, staying inside a monastery to pray and work in isolation, a friar belonged to a mendicant order. Friars did not stay behind stone walls. They traveled among the people to preach, hear confessions, and help the poor. However, while Little John, Will Scarlet, and Robin Hood built log cabins in the Sherwood Forest as their new homes, which by law they were not allowed to as the forest belonged to the king, they heard a strange story of which they believed to be ridiculous. Usually, fighting rings would be held for the sheriff's amusement and sometimes the king's, outside taverns and inns. Wagers would be made against fighters and the fighting competition would commence. Of course, this was never meant for peasants or yeomen to show their strength or earn coin for their skills, rather held strictly for the king's guards of higher class and warriors of the elite. But word got around of a curtal friar sneaking into such competitions and beating the living daylights of those higher class warriors. That wasn't the most baffling part though. Folk also said this friar was rather different. You would never see him without a bottle of ale in his hand. That statement was what threw off the merry men. Surely that wasn't correct, it didn't even sound remotely true. However, when Robin Hood ventured away from the forest, he then stumbled upon the friar sitting by a river with blood-stained knuckles drinking his ale. When Robin Hood saw him, he understood why they called him a curtal friar. He wore a dark brown kirtle or shortened habit. Long robes were impractical for traveling through the mud and brush of the forest, so he cut them short, a sign that this stranger valued utility over church tradition. Robin Hood, with his bow held tightly and proudly against him, looked at the rapid current of the river, then at the friar. He said, "Well, I wish to cross the river, friend." The friar took a sip of his ale from the bottle and replied, "Cross it then. I don't see anyone around telling you not to." The wind whistled through his messy brown hair and his green eyes had a glow to them in the moonlight. Robin Hood chuckled. "Aren't you a mouthy little shit? I was expecting help from what looks to be a fellow yeoman or maybe even a peasant to help a man out in his time of need." The friar responded, "Nothing is for free, nor should you be expecting anything from anyone. Offer me coin and I will take you across. When you're done with your errands, you will take me back to this end." "Or else," Robin said, and the friar responded, "or else I will break your nose 5 ways to Sunday." A challenge was issued, and by now, everyone knew Robin Hood never backed down from a challenge. So the two men engaged in a fist fight. And while the stranger appeared drunk, Robin couldn't keep up. He now knew why this friar had been winning his fights, for he was a boxer, a brawler of the most brutal kind. His footwork was hypnotizing. The sways of the hips with pivot turns were almost magical, like his body was made from an elastic band. His punches sharp and precise, generating power not just from the shoulder snaps, but from the legs channeling through like a wave. Straights, hooks, uppercuts, Robin Hood was in serious trouble. The outlaw managed to land a few good hits, but it wasn't enough. Eventually, he accepted defeat from the friar's mercy. Then the stranger said, "If I continue, your face wouldn't remain as charming as it is." However, the friar did not voice another thought he had. Despite losing the fight, he noticed Robin Hood never stayed down. No matter how hard the monk punched him, the man kept getting up. Robin Hood requested for the stranger to join the merryman. Then the man introduced himself as Friar Tuck. Unlike monks who belonged to monasteries that could be incredibly wealthy and own vast lands, Friar Tuck took strict vows of individual and communal poverty. He lived by begging, receiving alms, or working for his food. He was the people's priest. Because he lived among the common folk, Friar Tuck was often seen as more relatable and down-to-earth than the high-ranking bishops or wealthy abbots. He listened to folk, comforted them in their time of need, and while his appearance may show an unruly young man, there was kindness and pain behind those green eyes. He said to Robin Hood, "I bested you in a fist fight. Why would I need you or your crew? What can you possibly do that I cannot?" Robin Hood drew an arrow in his longbow and fired a shot at Friar Tuck. It traveled through the baggy segment of clothing under the friar's arm, creating a hole. But that wasn't the impressive part. How and when did Robin Hood fire another arrow to the opposite side of clothing, creating another hole at the exact same spot, will always remain a mystery. Friar Tuck was so bewildered and somewhat frightened from seeing a level of archery that looked quite terrifying, and decided to join the merrymen. Now the next member of the group was no outlaw, and while not a merry man, she was certainly a fierce rebel. Marian, the Shield Maiden, was a woman of high noble yeoman birth and bridged the gap between the aristocratic world and the outlaw world. She lived in a manor house as a ward of the High Court after her parents passed on. But Marian was no damsel in distress, nor did she want to be part of such a high-stature life. The Shield Maiden knew the ins and outs of the political world around her. She knew the nobles to bribe and the ones to threaten. She knew the villages or towns they would exploit and torment, or the locations in the forest that the King's Guard would patrol. Living as a ward of the court, hearing word of both classes came a lot easier. It also benefited her that she was breathtakingly beautiful. With her long red hair, blue eyes, and a smile to die for, the sheriff's guards would tell her secrets of confidential information without her even asking. But her beauty, much like the fashion sense of wool Scarlet, worked to her disguise. Give the woman a sword or a dagger and a shield at hand, and one might not have a throat left. However, Marian grew tired of living in the gap between people. She felt like she was destined to help the poor, to live a life that fulfilled her rather than gifted to her. So at night she would sneak out of the manor house, disguised as a knight, and patrol the forest not only to be in touch with nature, but to help people along the way. One such night, she stumbled upon an outlaw with his brown hooded cloak, kind eyes, and merry nature. Instantly, she recognized him from the rumors spreading in the High Council of an outlaw referred to as Robin Hood, the man who robbed from the rich and gave to the poor. Of course, Robin Hood never knew Marian wore the knight armor and challenged her to a duel. The ownership of the Sherwood Forest, though not legally, had slowly begun belonging to Robin, Little John, Will Scarlet, Friar Tuck, and anyone who was struggling in life. A knight with spotless armor of the highest, richest quality should not be roaming the forest unless they wished to kill someone. Marian and Robin Hood engaged in an epic though shortened battle, with the outlaw besting her. Upon defeat, she removed the helm and Robin Hood fell to the ground, bowing his head and apologized 100 times. But she never took offense. If anything, she was impressed. When Robin Hood blew a horn, the merrymen appeared like they were camouflaged in the forest, beckoning his call. Marian, the Shield Maiden, was the only member of the group that Robin never had to convince to join. She was the one who insisted. So the merrymen agreed, as her skills, inside information, and intelligence would help them give a better life to the poor. Robin Hood fell in love with Marian, but he never told her. At that time, with how things were, love had no place or time to occupy his heart. There were two other members that followed after her. Much the miller's son, who was a shorter version of Little John, a stout powerhouse of a man working on a farm that would later be burned down by the sheriff and his guards. He was the youngest of the Merrymen, and the group was very protective over him. The last member was the minstrel Alan Adale, a professional entertainer. Minstrels were the only people allowed to travel freely between warring territories. They could perform in a muddy tavern one night and a lord's great hall the next. In a world where most people couldn't read, the minstrel was the news. Alan didn't just sing songs, he sang ballads, long narrative poems that told the history of the land and the crimes of the sheriff. Alan was also the intelligence agent. Because he was just the entertainment, people spoke freely around him. He was the group's best spy because he was effectively invisible while standing in the middle of the room. He had a mullet hairstyle with the side shaved down to half an inch. Outside of performing, he wore spectacles and always read books or wrote down important information in his journals. However, it was one thing for all these valiant warriors in their own right to join Robin Hood, but it was another to stay with him, being part of the Merrymen for so many years. So what made Robin Hood so special? Well, in order to know about his actions, Robin Hood's tactics needn't be necessary if the Sheriff of Nottingham was a decent man. The Sheriff of Nottingham was a clear example of how monsters do not need long sharp teeth, smoldering red eyes, or razor-long claws to be scary or frightening. He wasn't a supervillain in the magical sense, rather he was a far more grounded and terrifying kind of evil, a corrupt bureaucrat with total local power. His evil didn't entail taking over the world. This was about greed, legal manipulation, and the cold-blooded exploitation of the social classes beneath him. The sheriff represented the law, but he used it as a weapon rather than a shield. Folk hated him because he was the face of institutional oppression. He didn't just collect what was owed to the king, he added fees for himself. If a farmer couldn't pay, the sheriff would seize their land, livestock, and tools, leaving families to starve. He also enforced royal forest laws, which meant ordinary people could be executed or mutilated for hunting a deer or even gathering wood to heat their homes. He protected the king's deer more than he protected the king's people, which became the biggest contention in the land. However, he didn't just target the poor. The sheriff used debt to trap minor knights and yeomen, seizing even their ancestral homes. He was the judge, jury, and executioner. If you had a grievance against a wealthy man who was the friend of the sheriff, you would never win in his court. He was a man who took pleasure in the courtesy of high society while being fundamentally dishonorable. The sheriff used public executions and the gallows not just for justice, but to instill fear. He was the kind of man who would hang the youth for poaching a rabbit just to make a point in the village, and no one could do a damn thing about it, or so he and the people believed, until Robin Hood came along. Robin and the Merrymen would intercept wagon deliveries of coin and food and give to the poor. The Merrymen only kept a portion to themselves, just enough for them to get by for the next day, and the cycle repeated. Sometimes when no station wagons passed through the forest, Friar Tuck would still find an excuse to find the higher class warriors and rearrange their faces with his fists. It was entertaining at first, but Robin Hood reprimanded him to tone it down a bit. Nevertheless, the sheriff was infuriated by this. Every thief that stole from him would always meet the gallows, but Robin Hood was no ordinary thief, and these secret missions didn't involve ordinary theft. This was personal. Robin constantly made the sheriff look incompetent. Every time he escaped a trap or disrupted the flow of money going to the higher class, the sheriff's reputation with the king and the nobility took a hit. To the sheriff, the social order was rigid. The powerful rule and the weak obey. A yeoman who refused to bow and who organized other men to resist was a virus that threatened the entire system of feudal control. But Robin Hood would never bow down to a man like that. He would serve the people, beg for them, shed blood, sweat, and tears for them, but he would not bend the knee for the sheriff or the king. However, times became tough. Transportation of such necessities became scarce and pathways changed, so much so that even Marian the Shield Maiden received no word about it. Things were kept secret now more than ever. With villages and towns starving, children falling ill, elderly dying from the cold, Robin Hood and the merry men felt a sense of worry. Robin had an idea, but he also knew on how this would further put a target on him and his friends. One day, on a dark, rainy afternoon, Robin went hunting alone when he saw a deer in his sights. The outlaw had a mischievous smirk on his face while calmly, quietly, and gently drawing an arrow in his bow. He poached a king's deer for the people, then another deer and another. The peasants and the yeomen were well fed, the merry men had enough to get by, and Robin Hood would sometimes lie and say his stomach was full, just so everyone could get a full plate meal. Oftentimes, without the merry men knowing, Robin would stay hungry for days. But he never worried about it. This wasn't for him anyway. This was for the people. However, the merry men too carried their weight. Little John would chop down trees in the forest and literally carry tree logs over his shoulder like they weighed nothing. Folk always had warmth. Will Scarlet bid farewell to the rich clothing and gave everything to the poor. Marian would take back the coin owed to the people by the court from corrupt cases and give back what was lost. Then Eleanor Dale would further irritate the sheriff and the higher class by singing his ballads outside their rich-owned taverns and inns. Friar Tuck would comfort people in need and guide them, that is when he wasn't beating up the king's guards in the forest. Much the miller's son would topple over wagon deliveries and carry everything he could in one large sack. When the sheriff found out the king's deer was poached by a lowly yeoman, a thief, an outlaw that was becoming a thorn in his backside, he conjured up a plan. He knew yeomen were skillful, but if there was one thing that was their greatest weakness, it was their pride. In order to finally catch and kill Robin Hood, then the Sheriff of Nottingham would need to lure the outlaw. And the only way he thought of doing was to hold an archery tournament. The sheriff organized the tournament in an open field outside the town walls to ensure the outlaws have no trees for cover. He offered a silver arrow with a head and feathers of red gold, a prize too prestigious for a proud yeoman like Robin Hood to ignore. But the sheriff never understood Robin Hood. He knew he was the best archer in the land. He never needed some silly tournament to prove that. This opportunity was for the people to see that a yeoman turned peasant was just as skillful and capable, if not more, than the king's guards. This was a chance for people to see on how the merry men have been changing the world while they were cast into the shadows, like they were worthless objects. Little John, however, did warn Robin Hood that this entire tournament was a trap. They all, except for Robin, had a terrible feeling about this whole thing. Nevertheless, the tournament wasn't just about hitting a bullseye, it was about hitting a wand, a thin willow branch from a massive distance. All the competitors gathered in a line while Robin and the merry men were disguised to avoid drawing attention. Many of the competitors fired their arrows in what seemed to be impressive efforts, but they never quite hit the wand. One by one, they were eliminated until the last two archers were left. Robin's opponent fired his arrow with such precision and skill, it struck the wand dead center. The crowd erupted, cheering and applauding. No archer has ever, in the history of the land, struck a target so accurately before, especially at that distance. Even the merry men were shocked. This competition was looking like a big mistake, and maybe Robin Hood overestimated himself. But the outlaw loosened his body and gave a cheeky smile. He drew an arrow in his bow and waited a long while. The silence was deafening. One could cut the tension with a knife. Not a single person moved, including the Sheriff of Nottingham. And then Robin released his arrow. It cut through the air, traveling like an arrow possessed by mastery, and split his competitor's arrow in two, reclaiming the wand for himself. The crowd burst into celebration. Folk chanted, applauded, and danced with merriment. However, Robin Hood never needed to remove his cloak or the fake beard and mustache. The sheriff knew it was him. He ordered the guards to attack and kill Robin Hood and the merry men. What started off as a peaceful, joyful, and exciting tournament had now become a killing floor. The outlaws were forced to shoot their way out. Thousands of arrows filled the air like a cloud of hornets. The people fought alongside the outlaws, but the bloodshed that day was horrific. The merry men pushed their way, trying to get to Robin Hood to protect him and the people. But Little John. An arrow struck the knee of Little John as it shattered the bone. The giant groaned in agonizing pain, limping and dragging himself towards Robin. The merry men saw this and increased their pace as well as their rage in battle. Robin Hood finally reached Little John and embraced his friend on the ground. John held Robin and begged the outlaw to kill him. He didn't want to slow them down. He wanted to die by the hand of a good man than to see his death by the Sheriff of Nottingham. Robin, with tears in his eyes, told him, "My brother, even if they gave me all the gold in England, it would never be enough for me to abandon you." And so, in a shocking, heroic effort, Robin Hood took a few deep breaths, then grunted loudly before picking up Little John on his back. The merry men surrounded the duo, fighting the guards and making sure they all got out safely. But what seemed to be a successful retreat from death was just the beginning. This was the only time really, that the Sheriff of Nottingham was one step ahead of Robin Hood. He expected the tournament to go as such. He knew that to catch a man like Robin Hood, you hit him where it hurts. When the merry men reached their hideout in the forest, they were stricken with horror. Marian, the shield maiden, asked, "Where's Much the Muller's son?" Friar Tuck looked around and didn't see him. Will Scarlet called out to him, but no one was there. Robin Hood told the rest of the merry men to tend to Little John's knee while he set out to find Much the Muller's son, not realizing that the Sheriff of Nottingham had already hired a hunter, an assassin of the most ruthless kind, that had kidnapped the youngest of the group. Guy Gisborne was a bounty hunter and a killer of men. He represented the dark side of yeomen, the side that gave in to the injustice, bending the knee to the sheriff. He wore a cloak made from a complete horse's skin, including the head, mane, and tail. Guy appeared to be a chimera, a half-man, half-beast entity that folk called the ghost of the forest because of the way he moved. But that wasn't the most terrifying part. He was just as skillful as Robin Hood with the bow. He was the one who shot Little John's knee at the tournament, standing a great distance away. He carried a long bow, a long sword, and a massive Irish knife. He was cold and merciless. This mercenary didn't work for the sheriff out of loyalty. He was doing it for the 200-pound bounty, for he had no yeoman honor. Robin Hood, running through the forest, stopped abruptly when he saw a tall man leaning against a tree with his arms folded. Robin thought he was looking at an actual monster, but it was Guy Gisborne. However, what Robin Hood saw at the mercenary's feet would always torment him. Much the Muller's son was on the ground covered in blood. There were 7 arrows stuck in his back, showing what a coward of a man Guy Gisborne was, that he knew fighting the powerhouse farmer face to face would mean certain defeat. And it got worse. Robin Hood fell to his knees holding his chest, struggling to breathe, and sobbed uncontrollably. Guy Gisborne had taken out the head of Much. Robin could feel his soul being ripped apart from the inside. He had never felt pain like that in his entire life, and suddenly, that pain turned to rage. He drew 2 arrows in his bow with lightning speed and fired it at Gisborne. The Battle of Robin Hood and Guy Gisborne was one of the most brutal fights to ever take place, not just in the Sherwood Forest, but in the land itself, lasting for 2 hours. Robin and Gisborne ran on opposite ends of the forest parallel to each other, firing arrows one after the other. None of them struck each other fully, just grazes and scrapes in the struggle. When the arrows ran out, Robin and Gisborne closed the distance and engaged in a sword fight. The bounty hunter was bigger than Robin, faster than him, stronger than him, but the outlaw stood his ground. He was driven by a newly found rage that burned deep within his soul. However, a man who had just fought hundreds, if not more guards just a few hours ago at the tournament, could only do so much. Guy Gisborne struck Robin's shoulder with a sword, dropping the outlaw to the ground. In what looked to be the end of Robin Hood, in his moment of near death, Robin found a surge of outlaw strength, leapt up and delivered a massive blow that cut Guy down where he stood. Unlike his character, Robin Hood roared at Gisborne as the bounty hunter slowly fell to the ground. Robin twisted the sword to inflict more pain, but that wasn't enough. After what this man had done to Much the miller's son, it wasn't enough. Robin Hood used Guy Gisborne's own Irish knife and hacked the bounty hunter's face until it became unrecognizable. He said, "Thou hast been a traitor all thy life, and now thou shalt be a traitor in the face." Robin Hood then removed Gisborne's head and stuck it on the end of his bow. Then he stripped the horsehide off Guy's body and put it on himself. Lastly, he pulled the horse head over his own and made his way to the Sheriff of Nottingham. Since the head stuck on the end of the bow was severely disfigured, and a man wearing a horsehide disguise stood in front of him, the sheriff was overjoyed, thinking Robin Hood has finally been killed. When the sheriff was caught off guard, Robin removed the horse's head and revealed he was very much alive. The king's guards by that time had already departed for the night, deep in their slumber, when Robin dragged the sheriff out of his home and took him to the village. The merry men received word of what Robin had been doing since he blew the horn to call upon them. They stole all the sheriff's gold from his home and followed to the village. But the merry men nor Robin Hood wanted to kill the Sheriff of Nottingham. Death would be an easy send-off for a horrible human being like that. The merry men climbed the rooftops of the village houses and toppled over the chests of coin onto the ground. To the village folk it rained gold, but they never rushed towards it or frantically heaped their pockets. They stood and watched the sheriff. They saw his face and the horror that consumed it. They witnessed the death of a man who was still very much alive, an evil man that valued riches, injustice, and corruption over the people. The village folk beat him with sticks and stones and cursed at him. Ashamed, disgraced, and stripped of his honor, the sheriff fled the land never to be seen again, knowing if he returned, the king would have him hanged for his blunder. That day, it wasn't just Robin Hood and the merry men who were victorious, it was also the people. Such was the story of Robin Hood and the merry men, the medieval outlaws, who robbed from the rich, gave to the poor, and gave rise to an epic tale of social justice. Robin Hood and the Merry Men will appear in Victor series, hence this video is very important. As some of you may know, the Robin Hood in the Werewolf series you've heard of thus far is a much older man, 20 years older to be exact. So from this point onwards, the series is going to take a turning point, and it's going to be really good if I may say so myself. If you enjoy my storytelling, be sure to leave a like, comment, or even subscribe if you haven't already. As for my loyal listeners that listen to every story that I write, I thank you from the bottom of my heart. Until the next one, do take care.